Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Yang. I'm a partner with ADL Ventures. I wanted to welcome contestants to the American-Made Challenges to our webinar today on designing supply chains for prize success and long-term resiliency. The word supply chain is probably a word that you've heard a lot in the last few years since the pandemic, and certainly it's one that's very critical to the solar industry. Though you may think it's something that applies only to larger scale businesses, it probably applies to your work on the prize today. So we'll talk today about developing a roadmap for success, not only in the long term, but in the very near term as well. So if you look at this first slide here, one of the things I wanted to lead with is to say that during the pandemic and as a result of the IRA, there are probably no two words in the solar industry today that are more important for entrepreneurs like yourself than the word supply chain. I think, in fact, it can be argued that supply chain is really what, in large part, motivated the IRA funding for solar in a way where it's not been deployed before in the U.S. And so certainly if you look at this graph, there's a couple of pretty clear trends. The overwhelming number of participants in the solar industry had significantly worse supply chain issues in recent years than they had before. A substantial amount have opted for more domestic purchasing, and we'll talk later about why that is, even in a Asian manufacturer-dominated industry, why that's prudent. And maybe most overwhelmingly on the cell and module side, over 80% of project developers now source from more than one vendor, and that's a critical concept that we're gonna touch on in our video. We're going to transition now to a slide on what are the actual available manufacturing incentives in the IRA for solar. And what you'll see is that traditionally, if you look at one of the reasons why China has been dominant in solar module manufacturing, it's really a function of long-term industrial policy, ranging from long-term loans to provincial and local financing for solar to other instruments like credit insurance. Of course, in the U.S. for a long time, the primary mechanism was the investment tax credit. But with IRA, there's now wholesale industrial policy in place to build a solar supply chain in the U.S. And that's perhaps been one of the most encouraging and interesting developments in the industry over the past year. So ADL did write a blog post last year on the IRA. You can certainly reference that for more information on the IRA. And of course, the other reality, which I don't think is going to change anytime soon, is the specter of tariffs. And so over the past 5 to 10 years, there have been a continual stream of tariff-related trade cases here in the U.S. The most recent one actually carried potential duties of as high as over 200%. So there's a lot of nuance behind how those are calculated and what the actual impact is on market pricing. But I think the short story is that for a lot of project developers, if they have a U.S.-made module or inverter or balance of system component that they can buy, they will do it even at a little bit of a higher price. And that's perhaps the underlying theme for why many of you are participating in these prizes, and why the supply chain element is so important for success, not only today, but down the road. It's really easy to talk about what a bad supply chain looks like. Most of you probably experienced this during the pandemic with shortages of common household items such as bottled water, toilet paper, other food and household items. So that's a very obvious, example that probably hits close to home. And I think if you look at the graph in this Wall Street Journal article, this is a broader commentary on supply chains in general, not just in the solar industry and energy, but across the entire economy. And so if you look at the volatility during the pandemic, it was several magnitudes more than past time periods. And I think this is what's really led to a lot of the behaviors and a lot of the policy changes and a lot of the business changes that have followed. On this slide, we're going to talk about what represents a successful supply chain and why is that actually important. I think this is a much harder and more subtle question to answer. But I will say in the manufacturing world, we would fairly religiously cite a book called The Goal. The Goal is a book that's focused on operational effectiveness, and in a few words, probably the key takeaway is reducing bottlenecks. And why is removing a bottleneck in a supply chain so important? Because that bottleneck is what limits your ability to turn raw materials into cash. If you think about how businesses are valued by investors and by customers, it's actually a common fallacy that businesses are valued solely on their earnings and income. In fact, some of the most successful and valuable companies, such as Amazon, were actually unprofitable for many years. But in the case of Amazon, they generated large amounts of cash very quickly. When you order something on Amazon, you pay for it, before they ship it, which is very different from a lot of industries, particularly solar manufacturing and project development, where you do something and you don't get paid for it until much later. So the best example of supply chain management from a cash flow standpoint might actually be a company like Dell. So in the 1990s, they pioneered the model of actually being paid for a computer before the parts were even ordered from a supplier. And they actually had what was called negative working capital. So the turnaround time from raw materials to finished goods, or in supply chain terms, the cash conversion cycle is absolutely critical to any business. You can even think about it at a very small scale for what you're doing for the ready or set phases of the prize, and ask yourself, how far in advance do you have to pay for goods and services that are actually required for you to get the funding in this prize? And what in most cases you realize it actually takes months or years for you to get paid. And I think that's why supply chain management is so important as you scale up, because if it takes months or years to realize your return on investment on something like a factory or on a major project development, you're talking millions, or in some cases even billions of dollars. So what are some key takeaways for prize participants in this? I think, again, even in designing the prototype for the ready phase, good supply chain management is absolutely critical, because even on day one, you may have material supplies or vendor services that you need for the ready, set, and go phases that have very long lead times and or low availability. So I can't reemphasize enough, if you haven't thought about this for all three phases of the prize, think through your key needs for executing on your idea, and make sure that you address them now. For those of you that are applying to prizes other than the solar prize that may not be multi-phase in nature, we would add that same key message. There's probably not a single prize across the AMC network where supply chain from either goods or services standpoint may not have some critical failure mode where risk needs to be hedged. I think in light of what has happened during COVID, I would also expect other funding sources that you want to get as a result of the prize, both government grants and investors, and as well as corporate partners, to ask smart questions about your supply chain scale up. So know where you're getting your materials and supplies from, know what you need to deliver your product or services, and know what the risks are. Because I think an honest and whole risk assessments will be just as important as an assessment of the upsides of what you're doing. And certainly any large scale expansion, particularly of manufacturing, is going to require even more detailed diligence on supply chain factors. And if you think about sort of the supply chain and what the ideal supply chain might look like, maybe the best example of lean supply chain management is factory clusters in Asia, where products like LCD displays that actually require $1 billion equipment investments and large amounts of very expensive raw materials. The entire supply chain is located often in the same town, sometimes in the same factory park. And so you'll notice that the Wall Street Journal article we cited above talked about nearshoring. And so though you've seen some of this in the auto assembly world with car plants and tire plants being near each other, it really hasn't been as big of a consideration in the US, because we don't have as many industries which are as capital intensive and high volume as displays. But the IRA incentives for solar, very clearly motivate not only cell and module manufacturers, but also other material and component suppliers to consider this type of strategy for not only onshoring or nearshoring. So I think that's a key consideration to think about as you cultivate your work, not only for the prize, but also beyond, is not only having a supply chain, but having that supply chain being as localized and personalized in nature. Because if you're doing business with people you can't shake hands with and can't touch on a personal basis, that always makes the interaction slightly more difficult. So in solar, what part of the supply chain are you actually positioned in, and who are the buyers, end users, and other influencers? In this particular slide, you'll see a fairly straightforward and traditional value chain for polysilicon solar cells, which of course account for nearly 90% of the solar power generation in the US. However, I'd note that for each layer of this value chain, what product or service you offer could have a huge impact on what supply chain levers you need to focus on. So for example, for a solar panel made of polysilicon, it's always the price and availability of polysilicon that's a major determinant of your cost structure, as well as your ability to produce and deliver product effectively. For something like a balance of system component, like a racking or single axis tracker, it could be tied to commodity pricing and other trade conditions like tariffs around raw materials like steel. So I think as a business, you just need to sit down and assess intelligently what are the key risk factors, and again, what are the potential bottlenecks that could shut you down completely or prevent you from doing business completely from a supply chain perspective. And we'll talk in a couple of slides about how damaging the impact of something like that can be when you can't run your business at all. As a business, you also need to ultimately assess the benefits of horizontal integration or vertical integration in the supply chain. Horizontal integration means providing more products and services in the same layer of the value chain. Vertical integration means providing products and services in multiple layers of the value chain. And then both of these are typically achieved at larger scale through acquisitions. But I would note that even in prizes, many of you coming to us for support ask us questions about product and service offerings, and should you offer more than one product or service as part of a stack of things you're putting in your prize application. Should you consider integrating in the value in the value chain, and finding whether through teaming partners or through internal investments, integration capabilities. So I think this is something that comes up even at the very early stages of your business. You may remember in our webinar on value proposition development, we highlighted First Solar, Tesla, and SolarEdge as 3 success stories in the solar industry. And in this particular session, we're going to actually look at them from a supply chain standpoint through a little bit of different angle. So First Solar, as we mentioned before, acquired project developers to vertically integrate from panels into systems. This allowed them to deal directly with financiers and sell projects as opposed to sell panels. And for them, that was successful because they got access to investor capital, and they got access to larger scale sales. Certainly, I would say in the solar industry, not every attempt at vertical integration has been successful. And I think the ongoing question of whether to have project development vertically integrated with cell and module manufacturing is an ongoing debate. And so similar to how thick ties and skinny ties sort of go in and out of fashion on a cyclical basis, I think whether you vertically integrate into project development, it can be very specific based on timing and other business conditions. So there's no right answer, but we would certainly point out that First Solar was very successful by vertically integrating. Similarly, in the case of a horizontal integration, Tesla, as you may remember, started out as an EV manufacturer that also sold energy services into homes. They bought Solar City to horizontally integrate across a broader scope of energy service offerings, and they use that as a way to increase revenue and market share in home energy services. I think they use that as a way to build out the platform and the roadmap of the company. So although Tesla's not seen today as maybe a major player in solar, I think Tesla having that presence in residential solar has enabled the company to be successful in a lot of other ways. And again, we talked about the Amazon and Dell example. I think both First Solar and Tesla were great examples of companies that actually used integration through mergers and acquisitions to actually increase their attractiveness to investors and to increase their market cap, which then allowed them to raise funding more easily and more cheaply at scale. So although acquisitions are common for value chain growth, and we've been in a record M&A environment in the last few years, I think it's also important to remember that de-integration can sometimes be effective as integration. Perhaps there's no better example of that than SolarEdge. So for I think those of you that were at RE Plus with ADL, among the 40,000 attendees, you certainly saw that SolarEdge was one of the most crowded booths, and they continue to be a market leader in microinverters using contract manufacturing. So what that means is they pay the contract manufacturer a markup to make their product, but they avoid the issues of having to manage their own equipment and material supply chain. That allowed them to focus on core strengths such as sales and marketing. And there are similar stories in other industries like semiconductors. Perhaps a good one that a lot of you know about is NVIDIA. They make a lot of the computer chips that drive AI, gaming, and other forms of advanced computing. They're now one of the very few $1 trillion companies on the market, and they actually outsource their production entirely to foundries like Taiwan Semiconductor. In any event, no matter what business you're in, again, it's critical to determine what part of the supply chain your business falls in, and then who are the people you're either buying from or selling to, and how much of that are you selling. So in our next slide, we're going to talk about designing the supply chain and making some of these important large-scale decisions. I think some of these key considerations could include just-in-time versus having inventory on hand, domestic versus foreign sourcing. We talked earlier about multiple vendors versus single source. And of course, the price and structure of key purchasing agreements, including the time frame and other business terms. So we have a slide here showing what's called just-in-time inventory management. For many years, Toyota has been a popular case study in just-in-time inventory management. So I think in the simplest scenario, you receive a sales order for your product or service, you order the needed goods and services to deliver that order, and then you fulfill that order to get paid. I can say in solar, it rarely is that simple. I think there's a lot of other considerations, and some of the key considerations here include the following. So one key question is like, how much inventory of key materials and supplies should you have on hand? I think in solar, even at the lab stages where many of you are working for this prize, that answer is almost never zero. This is particularly important for manufacturers that have specialized technologies. The lack of one key component for your solar panel or one spare part for a piece of equipment could actually shut down an entire factory with hundreds or thousands of workers. So in my prior company, we had a manufacturing operation that was big by US standards, but certainly very small compared to Chinese manufacturers. Yet what's called a gap out or a stop in production costs us $80,000 per day. That's the cost to run the factory, whether you're making product or not, because you're paying workers, you have utilities, rent, and other expenses that unfortunately don't disappear if your factory has stopped. And I can tell you there's no more painful feeling than having a sold out factory grind to a halt for a small supply chain issues. So certainly there's some calculations that you can do to see how much material you consume on a daily basis, how much of it you need to have on hand if the lead time is a certain number of days or weeks. But I think in solar, and particularly in the recent environment, you also have to expect the unexpected. So whether it's a rail strike, it's a hurricane, or it's some other unpredicted disaster, there are a lot of things that can knock out your factory. And I think in the long run, as you progress beyond this prize, good supply chain management goes hand in hand with good contingency planning. So some of the other considerations we talked about include domestic versus foreign and multiple versus single source. The closer the vendor and the more you have, the less likely you are to be stopped in your tracks. Of course, that also compromises your ability to get the best price both today and in the future with those suppliers. So there's no right answer for how to manage your supply chain. You can only do what makes business sense and hope that luck is also in your favor. That being said, we would always advise startups to think of contingency planning as cheap insurance. I think even as early as the ready phase, you may encounter equipment or material decisions that could make or break your project. Having something that is efficient and user-friendly and works is probably more important than getting the lowest price or the shorter lead time. And I would add, some of you watching this video may not only be looking at prize funding, but also funding opportunity announcements, which are supported by ADL and other power connectors. I would add that often in funding opportunity announcements, there's anything between softer to very concrete criteria to actually buy all the equipment and materials from the United States. So I think in some cases there's a choice. I think in some cases, if you're applying for funding from DOE and NREL, there actually isn't a choice, and you have to focus on domestic procurement. And certainly a big part of why we're doing this prize work and a big part of why the IRA exists is to shore up those domestic supply chains and to make those choices easier for you. And so certainly as a participant in the solar industry, who had a factory in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, I can say from experience that we built a breakthrough facility in a part of America where there really wasn't a lot of prior engineering or technical expertise, and we were able to get 2/3 of our supply or more on a consistent basis from U.S. suppliers, and tens or hundreds of those vendors were actually people that were state and local suppliers, and so I do think with the IRA, this is a really encouraging opportunity for all of you to both jump in as participants in the U.S. solar supply chain, as well as to really take a hard look at whether some of your foreign supply needs can now be met by U.S. suppliers. I think at the heart and soul of every supply chain conversation is purchasing. Of course, at the end of the day, this is a transaction that involves you buying something from a vendor for a price and other terms. We've included here a sort of a generic slide. This is a vendor due diligence checklist, and this is an example of some of the homework that you should do on your vendors. But if you've watched our module on bankability, you also know that the people you're selling to are probably doing the same homework on you as a potential vendor to them. So I think this is a really critical concept for any participant in the solar industry. And as you think through vendor relationships, we'll talk here mostly in a purchasing capacity. There's a few things to think through. How many vendors should you have for a given product or service? Where are these vendors from? If they're domestic, what are the delivery times, and what are other factors, whether it be natural labor, organized labor disruptions, or other things that may stand in the way of you getting that product delivered in a worst case scenario. Certainly cost optimization, you hear supply chain managers talk so often about costs, but I really often think about it as a trade-off between flexibility versus long-term pricing. Obviously, if you bought a large volume of supplies, all of them were bought from one supplier, and you committed to do this for 5 or 10 years, you would probably get the best possible price that supplier can give you, especially if you pay a fair amount upfront. But for a small business, flexibility can be much more important, and you often don't have the resources to automatically get to that long-term pricing. And so thinking about how you build relationships and how you develop growth with your suppliers is going to be extremely important, and like I said, may even be important in this particular prize. Certainly lead times are critical. We talked about the supply chain situations in our everyday lives that don't go well. And again, using the Amazon example, this is why Amazon is so valuable, because they're able to deliver most things to you in a day or less. And so lead times of your suppliers is extremely critical, especially if you're working on something time constrained, like the ready, set, or go phases of this prize. You may think about a couple months as being a long time until you realize what some of your lead times are for the materials or other services that you actually need to execute. And I would be very clear in saying that it's not only goods, but also services that need to be thought of in this mentality. Obviously, there have been a lot of labor shortages during the pandemic. So some of you that may be, again, relying on things like contract manufacturing, engineering services, and other specialized forms of labor, like I would assume that those are going to be equally hard to procure as some of these long lead time materials. And so anticipating those bottlenecks, anticipating those long lead times, I think that's part of what makes you successful in the long run. At the end of the day, none of us can avoid these mistakes, but it's mitigating these mistakes and trying to minimize them that's really important. So we've gone through a lot of factors on like how to build a supply chain and how to evaluate suppliers. We actually haven't talked at all about probably one of the most important parts, which is actually quality, because assuming that you're actually able to buy what you need and the time that you need on the price and other terms that you need, by the way, you still need to actually make something that's of high quality and is trusted by your customer. And so in the solar industry, particularly for cells and modules, there are some common industry standards for quality that apply not only to the cells and modules, but also to a lot of the subcomponents and materials that are supplied into those value chains. These could be things like backsheets, junction boxes, other components ISO 9000 for factories is a big one. In our bankability webinar, we talked about third-party audits. I think third-party factory audits of suppliers are also common, and probably will be increasingly common given some of the recent supply chain shocks. And then I think with quality, there's always a question of like, what quality metrics are you aiming for, and how much do you have to pay to buy these metrics? Because at the end of the day, this also translates to the customer's willingness to pay. And so in your customer discovery, you need to actually validate, do your customers care about paying for something like an ISO 9000 or another third-party standard of quality that probably requires a different level of rigor through your supply chain, than not meeting that standard and ignoring it. So I think willingness to pay is an important question to ask, and sometimes I think you don't even have the luxury of like getting a premium price. You may find that this is simply a gateway to getting your product sold at all. And again, I'll reference our other webinar on bankability, as well as our webinar we did earlier on value propositions. All these things actually tie together, but it's impossible to execute any of the value proposition selling or any of the bankability work without having a sound supply chain. Because obviously, if you're making a product or delivering a service and you don't have the subcomponents that are needed to do that, you don't have a value proposition at all. So we really can't overemphasize how important supply chain is to success in the solar industry. Lastly, once the product is made and it's been vetted, there's actually logistics to think about as well. I think the most simple question, of course, is where are you shipping product to? But I think that's in many cases, much more loaded answer, particularly for higher value products like solar modules and inverters. And so I think from a practical standpoint, one thing to think through is the type of shipping. There could be air freight, there could be boat, there could be rail, there could be car, and there could be truck. I think not even during the pandemic, but just traditionally, I think you've seen things like hotshot trucking and air freight, of course, be very, very expensive. And so like getting the product to your customer in time, which again is dependent on the supply chain planning in the earlier parts of the value chain, I think helps save a lot of costs on logistics. And then when you think about exports and imports, this pertains both to buying your supplies as well as ultimately to shipping your product to customers. The concept of Incoterms is very important, and we've shown Incoterms here on this slide. And probably the easiest way to boil it down for an early stage company is Incoterms have an implication on when ownership is transferred to of your product. So, for example, if you think about a sales order that's shown here as X Works, and you have an X Works sales order where you're paid up front, as soon as your product has been sold to your customer, they've picked it up and they've paid, they're the owner of record and they bear the risk of loss for transporting it back to their site or to where it's going to be installed. But there are other forms of Incoterms that are probably a little bit more buyer friendly, where you assume increased risk, and then sometimes you get a premium, sometimes you don't. And so there's a big risk return dynamic that goes into logistics. And then again, with logistics for running a factory or running a project, there's other economic considerations that come into play as well. Like, what's the standing cost for running a factory? Are there liquidated damages or other penalties that need to pay to investors if projects can't be built on time? So things that maybe appear simple, are not. So the last slide here, we just show a picture of a successful product shipment being received in a factory and that product being installed. This is the endpoint that we're all striving for. And so I think as you work through the prizes, we want to use this webinar as a learning rather than purely as a way of cautioning you about risks, right? Because I think there's a lot of upside in doing it right. And I think good sound planning helps get you there. And so I'll end the session by saying that we've never been more optimistic here at ADL. And I think I'd say this probably for our other power connectors and NREL as well. We've never been more optimistic about the future of the U.S. Solar industry and the number of innovators that are entering through these prizes. And I think we hope that you use these planning and risk management tactics as a way to get to success. And so encourage you guys to all contact us as a team and to touch base more if you have any questions on this or any of the other webinar information we provided. We're very excited to have you as applicants for the prizes and work with you in other capacities going forward as well. So thanks a lot for your time and hope you have a wonderful day.